Kia ora, I'm Sharon Brett-Kelly. Like it or not, we've needed to spend more money on defence for years, and today it's even more urgent.
We're living in a much more dangerous world, a much more challenging world. That probably means we're going to have to do a lot more for ourselves and working with our ally Australia.
Our cash-strapped, underfunded, overspent Defence Force is in the spotlight again, just as revelations come that the Chinese Navy is very close.
The Defence Force is monitoring 3 Chinese Navy ships sailing east of Sydney. Defence Minister Judith Collins says the government has not been informed by the Chinese government why the ships have been deployed into the region.
And in the same week, we hear that our peacekeepers could be heading for Ukraine.
I'm prepared to consider committing British forces on the ground alongside others if there is a lasting peace agreement.
It is something that we'd be open to, but obviously it's speculative at this point. But we do support a lot of peacekeeping missions around the world.
But the pressure is on New Zealand to do more.
There is a silence in New Zealand around this right now. You only have to look at what's happening in Europe or in the Indo-Pacific, and there is an arms race of the type we've not seen for decades going on.
But even if we add billions more to the budget, what will it get us?
The shoulder-fired Javelin uses automated guidance to shatter tank armor with a top-down impact. Just one Javelin system can cost over $200,000.
That's one weapon. But what about a whole ship?
The HMNZS Manawanui, a $100 million New Zealand Navy ship, the ship sinking an enormous financial hit for the Defence Force.
We're pretty much being cut down to the bone. And so it's not even about trying to keep up with our competitors or our friends. We're going to have a gap now. And so that's going to have to be some difficult budgetary questions for the government to replace this.
Today on The Detail, the defence budget, how would we spend the extra money?
We are responsible for 11% of the surface of planet Earth. Think about that. And yet we think we can do it by penny pinching our way forward. The only people who pay are our military personnel.
More from former Defence Minister Ron Marks soon. But first, the potential role of our peacekeepers in Ukraine. David Cappy is the director of the Centre for Strategic Studies at Victoria University.
One of the challenges here is that there's not a lot of specificity. It's still very, very early days. The idea of some sort of peacekeeping force in Ukraine is something that's sort of developed over the last year. French President Macron mentioned the possibility of European troops in Ukraine a little over a year ago. And I think the election of President Trump has just sped this process along a bit, where European countries are having to think about the possibility of who would offer Ukraine some sort of security guarantees if there were a ceasefire or there were some sort of peace agreement. And the US has said, it wouldn't be a NATO force. And so the Prime Minister's been asked about it in that context, but it's still, very early days. There's a lot that's not clear and a lot of complications before any kind of force could be deployed.
What would our peacekeepers do there?
Well, again, a lot depends on precisely what the force is tasked to do. So, one of the questions is, at the moment, there's obviously about 1,000-kilometre line of contact or front line between Ukrainian and Russian forces, where they're engaged in some pretty brutal fighting. One idea that's been talked about is that you would possibly have Russian or Ukrainian forces draw back from that line of contact, and then you would have international forces that would provide some sort of oversight of that area, providing some sort of security guarantee to Ukraine. Now, again, it's very much at the hypothetical, very, very early days here. But if, New Zealand obviously has been involved in training Ukrainian forces with British forces. And so it's not impossible to imagine that New Zealand might contribute to, for example, a headquarters or an intelligence assistant role through to some sort of contribution to a larger force, which would do some of that monitoring of the zone between the Russians and the Ukrainians.
Well, if it's right there on the border, could it be dangerous?
I mean, hypothetical, but absolutely. European commentators have said that the kind of force that might be required to police a line of contact that long would be tens of thousands of troops. It could be 40,000, one number, even 100,000. We also know that, even before Russia's full-out invasion in February 2022, there was obviously a lot of fighting and violence, sporadic violence in the Donbass. And Organization for Security Cooperation in Europe, observers who were in place before the war broke out, the full-on invasion broke out, were killed in incidents then. Again, a lot remains to be seen, but this would likely have to be a pretty robustly armed and equipped force were it to operate in that sort of context.
Our peacekeepers are already in a lot of places around the world. We're also hearing that our defence budget is very tight at the moment. Is this the right way to spend our money?
Well, I think first of all, you're right. New Zealand has been an active contributor to peacekeeping forces around the world for decades. Right now, the current government has increased some of those deployments. So we have peacekeepers, for example, in the Sinai, in parts of the Middle East, on the Korean Peninsula, but also in places like South Sudan. Sometimes they're quite small numbers of people, but making a real difference. The current government has increased some of those deployments, most notably on the Korean Peninsula. And I think that one of the things they feel is that that's actually, good for morale. It's good for NZDF to be able to hold out the prospects of deployments for people who might be thinking of wanting to sign up to see the world rather than just be stuck at home. But there's no doubt that these missions are not just dangerous, but they're also expensive. But a lot depends, again, on the kind of contribution. It might be a small number of people. It could also be a larger force. New Zealand has global security interests and is already playing an active role and wanting to contribute to the situation in Ukraine. So it's not surprising that the Prime Minister has at least wanted to leave open the option of playing some role were such a force to be put together.
The one thing I do know for absolute certain is that we have a very good reputation internationally as peacekeepers. And we've held roles at the infantry level, boots on the ground. And you only need to look at Bosnia, what we did there, look at East Timor. We were in Afghanistan for 20 years.
So we'd be in demand.
Well, I think the first thing we have to accept is that New Zealand will be in demand because of its flag. And it's always good to have as many different nations contributing towards an international peacekeeping mission such as this. We are not the type of nation that operates outside of its mandate, operates outside of the rules of engagement. We're very strict on ourselves. We train our people well. And I think one of the things that often gets missed is that Kiwi service personnel are exceptionally good with integrating into foreign environments, different conflicts where cultures, religions, and languages are mixed and varied. And that comes from, I've always personally believed, our egalitarian nature and the values we have as Kiwis. And so we are sought after.
And I guess it depends on, who we send and where they would go. But there's a possibility that they could be near the border with Russia, which could put them in danger.
There's always danger in peacekeeping operations, peacemaking operations, but that level of risk and threat is measured against the role you undertake. If you're manning a checkpoint, such as Fijian soldiers were when the Israeli-Lebanon war broke out, some of those checkpoints wore the brunt of it, and we saw the casualties. And things can go wrong, and it does take a particular mindset. It's a mindset that I've only ever found in the military, where people, as a matter of course and a matter of fact, put themselves and their personal safety behind those of the needs and the safety of the people they're there to protect and to support. And I think that's actually the nature of most of our Five Eyes partners.
Given that our Defence Force is pretty cash-strapped at the moment, is this the right way to spend money? Or is it a case of we can't afford to not send our troops there?
That is a key factor. Nations are going to be judged in the future by Ukraine. and by the next generation of Ukrainians, be they civilians, be they military, or be they politicians, against what they contributed when Ukraine faced its darkest hour. And having been there personally just after the Battle of Kyiv, having been to Bucha, having been to Chernihiv, having regular contact with people in Ukraine, you're judged by the company you keep, and you're judged by what you do, not what you say. I guess it's fair to accept some criticism from some people I talked to in Ukraine that if they compare New Zealand's contributions to the Ukraine war on a per capita basis, dollar per capita basis, against other nations such as Australia, I can understand why they feel that we haven't done enough, or we haven't done as much as other nations. But our governments have made their decisions and made their choices around what they're prepared to fund. And, 104 million is a lot to Kiwis, but in a 3-year war, it's probably a day's combat or less than that, probably a few hours. Can you afford not to be there? As we look ahead to the future, when we have a normalization, when we have peace, Ukraine is trying to rebuild the towns, the villages that have been decimated, recover from the trauma of it, and reestablish their agricultural sector, their manufacturing sector, and establish exports and start to earn revenue to pay for that recovery. You could excuse them for picking their friends on what they perceive their friends' contributions were. I guess there's no higher price you pay than committing your military personnel to the defence of a peace agreement, to a peace treaty that brings peace and security to their people as a whole. I think our people in government will be mindful of that. I know the Minister of Foreign Affairs will definitely be very mindful of that. If we want to be trading in the European market, if we want to recover our economic circumstances by broadening our trade beyond a heavy reliance on the United States or beyond a heavy reliance on China, then Europe is most certainly an attractive place to be. But of course, you've got to be seen as valuable. You've got to be seen as reliable. You've got to be seen as concerned about the safety and well-being of their people as much as you're concerned about your own economic circumstances. These are things that will maybe unspoken. It's not to say they won't be thought about.
To Defence Force spending now, and a boost to the current 1% of GDP looks close to a done deal.
The government has all but confirmed it will lift New Zealand's defence spending in the near term, though details like when and by how much are still unclear.
We will be spending more on defence.
2%?
Well, we will be getting as close to 2% as we possibly can. We know that's the pathway that we want to get
and
to.
How quickly?
Ways people measure it. Again, we're working that through with our defence capability plan.
Here's David Cappy again.
I can't see New Zealand spending 2% anytime very soon. There's a number of reasons for that. I mean, I think one of the things is it's not like you just write a check and defence expenditure suddenly miraculously takes place. If you're needing to invest in new ships, new aircraft, to invest in people, that's not something that you just go out and buy off a shelf. You would need to increase defence expenditure in a sort of gradual way. You'd have to grow it. But I do think we do need to spend more. I do think we will spend more. I think almost every political party in Parliament has come out at some point and made some comments about needing to invest in the Defence Force and to spend more. I think, in some ways, this 2% figure that's now got bandied around, particularly in the sort of context of President Trump's comments around NATO, is a bit misleading.
I'm also going to ask all NATO nations to increase defense spending to 5% of GDP, which is what it should have been years ago. It was only at 2%, and most nations didn't pay until I came along. I insisted that they pay, and they did.
The most important thing is not to be harnessed to some sort of arbitrary figure or some sort of figure of GDP, but really to work out what is we want a defence force to do, how we want it to be structured and organised, and then to find a way, and then to pay for that. And I think sometimes we get a bit fixed on these numbers, whereas and this idea we would do it because somebody else expects it. I think the most important reason we should be investing in defence is for our own interests, not because somebody else might expect it. We're living in a much more dangerous world, a much more challenging world. That probably means we're going to have to do a lot more for ourselves and working with our ally Australia. And so it's important, I think, to have the kind of defence force that we need to fund it properly, and also to fund it on a sustainable basis so that it's not just a question of a big flashy announcement and a purchase and then the next year the funding drops back.
How would New Zealanders take this, though? Right now we've got a health system in crisis. Cost of living for individual New Zealanders is sky high. Do you think there is an appetite amongst New Zealanders for more spending on defence?
I mean, I think you're right that the politics around this is challenging. There are many things that our Defence Force does all the time that New Zealanders, we know that they hugely value, whether it's work in the Pacific, providing humanitarian assistance or disaster relief, supporting science in Antarctica, as well as peacekeeping missions and peace deployment, as well as support for global security interests. I do believe that New Zealanders do have a real sense that the world is changing. I think even over the last month or 6 weeks, it feels like that change, that move towards a world that is less predictable, that's more challenging for a small country, a small open trading nation, that's permeated public consciousness.
If more money does go into defence, what would be the priorities?
So the government at the moment has said it will sometime soon announce what's called the Defence Capability Plan, which is really in some ways the last part of a process which has reflected on New Zealand's broader defence policy. So there was a sort of an overview of the strategic environment. Then there was a document released at the very end of the Hipkins government, which talked about the kind of principles that would underpin a defence force. And there it talked about things about wanting to have a combat-capable defence force, not just, for example, a kind of civil defence or Coast Guard role. Wanting to be able to do things concurrently. So we need to have a force that is able to respond if we have a natural disaster in the Pacific, if we're doing something in Antarctica, and also we're contributing to a global security operation somewhere else. That means we might need multiple assets and platforms, and also a more resilient force. And then the third part of that review is what's called the Defence Capability Plan, and that starts to talk much more specifically about the areas where you need to see investment and matches it with the kind of spending and investment planning that's required. And I think we'll have to wait and see what's actually in the Defence Capability Plan when it finally comes out. But one of the areas that clearly is going to get attention is in New Zealand's maritime assets.
Former Defence Minister Wayne Mapp expects the plan could offer two tracks, a high-cost one and a low-cost. But he also points out that just one big buy like the P-8 Orions can push up the spend rapidly, and that now it's the Navy's turn.
Frigates are sort of a $3 or $4 billion item, and that's just getting two of them. That's just sort of getting exactly what we've got now. If you wanted to sort of increase to three, well, you're going to be making a big difference.
Every ship in the Royal New Zealand Navy, apart from the tanker Aotearoa, needs to be replaced by the mid-2030s. So that's pretty confronting for a country that has something like the fifth or sixth largest exclusive economic zone in the world. So, you've got ships like Canterbury, like the two Anzac frigates. Obviously, Manawanui was lost in the disaster off Samoa. You've got the offshore patrol vessels and so on. And all of these need to be replaced. And successive governments have kind of kicked the can down the road and not squared up to that. And so I think that's the area that's, I would imagine, will get a lot of attention in the DCP.
And in terms of weaponry, that kind of thing, I mean, it must be so difficult now to keep up with the latest because, it's so high-tech and it's developing so quickly. I mean, does a small defence force like New Zealand's even try?
Well, I think New Zealand has a comparatively small defence force, and it also has the challenge of being a bit like a Swiss Army knife, where it's expected to do a huge number of different tasks. At one end, search and rescue and disaster relief, but at the other end, being able to operate in potentially areas of combat and conflict. And so, you're right. One of the challenges is that defence technology moves very quickly. It's also incredibly expensive. One of the things I think we've seen from the government in the last sort of 15 or 16 months is the principle of working very closely with Australia. So our ally Australia, looking for opportunities to closely integrate our defence force with Australia's. So I think that's one area where thinking about us being a smaller part of a larger whole, as well as wanting to do things for our own sovereign and independent interests. I think one of the other things with defence technology is also it's moving in ways that can potentially have advantages for small defence forces. So if we think, for example, about the development in autonomous systems, uncrewed systems, or even if you look at, for example, Navy frigates, the crew that's required of some modern Navy vessels is much smaller than the kind of crew that's required to operate the sorts of ships that New Zealand operates today that were bought back in the late 1980s. And then the same is true for sensors and so on as well. So there is a real challenge too, and particularly around the eye-watering cost of defence technologies is leaping ahead.
Ron Mark agrees that our Navy needs more.
We are responsible for 11% of the surface of planet Earth. Think about that, 11%. Our area of operations covers the whole of Europe and part of Africa. If you overlay our AO across Europe and Africa, if you overlay it across the Americas, it takes in Canada, the United States, the Caribbean, and part of Mexico. And yet we think we can do it by penny pinching our way forward. The only people who pay are our military personnel. They pay for it in the lousy pay conditions that they have to put up with because they don't have a union like the teachers and the nurses. They can't fashionably be on television at night advocating for their own conditions of service. There are soldiers living in barracks that I was in when I was a 16-year-old soldier, and they haven't changed. If you're going to address that backlog of issues, if you're going to address the forward needs of our developing a strong, credible defence force with the capabilities required to operate in a modern battle space, then you've got to invest money. I'm sorry. And if you don't think it's worth it, then think about what other people think of you when you are asking them for free trade agreements and for better concessions and better access to their markets. Why would they want to help you if you're not particularly concerned about their safety and security? And New Zealand, I hate to say it about all of us, we seem to think that if it all goes wrong, we'll be safe down here. Well, our trade routes aren't safe. And if we are not prepared to demonstrate a commitment to securing trade routes, to looking after our friends and like-minded nations upon whose support we rely in forums such as the United Nations, and we're not prepared to demonstrate that we're concerned about them, then why the hell should they be concerned about us? And the world is a volatile space, and it's been increasingly so. And the one thing you can absolutely bank on is that what you think today is going to be the situation tomorrow will not be.
That's it for today. The Detail is a newsroom production supported by RNZ and NZ On Air. This episode was engineered by Phil Benge and produced by Gwen McClure. Thanks to Ron Mark and David Cappy. I'm Sharon Brett-Kelly. Mā te wā.